Depending on which news feed you read this morning, you will hear two different versions of the Nigel Farage Conservative Party approach. One is that a connection between the Conservatives and Reform is inevitable, and the other is the Nigel Farage line, no deals, just a reverse takeover. The interesting question is not whether he wants a formal pact now, he plainly doesn't at the moment, but how far structural pressures, numbers and Tory panic might drag both sides towards some form of accommodation by 2029. So the numbers, the incentives, the 2019 betrayal, the internal politics of each party, and the probability judgment, these are the questions that are being raised tentatively today in the press. The polling landscape, recent YouGov Westminster voting intention has Reform in the high 20s to 26% in the latest snapshot, slightly down, with Labour and the Conservatives tied around the high teens. The September YouGov MRP model went further, projecting that that on the then current figures, Reform could be the largest party with around 300 seats, with Labour well behind and the Conservatives reduced to a few dozen MPs. Reform has also been first in several multi-party polls where Labour and the Tories are bunched together in the teens. So paradox number one, Reform appears in polling to be powerful enough to wreck the Conservatives, but still may be short of a clean majority. The Conservatives are too weak to win outright, but still strong enough to stop Reform in dozens of seats if they split the right-leaning vote. That is exactly why donors and some Conservative figures whisper that they will have to come together if the right is to rule again. Under first past the post, two hungry dogs chasing the same rabbit often end up starving. Against this structural backdrop, the current messaging is pure theatre. The public never versus the private inevitable. In private, according to the Financial Times, Farage has told donors that some form of deal or merger with the Conservatives is inevitable before the next election, but only on Reform's terms, only on his terms, and only after further Tory collapse. Only after, I suspect, more Tories emigrate from the Conservative Party to Reform, more sitting Tories emigrate. And I imagine that will happen shortly after the May elections. It may happen slightly before them. It depends on the mood and on the tension. In public, on GB News and Twitter, Farage calls reports of a pact false and ludicrous, insisting, "I would never do a deal with a party I don't trust. No deals, just a reverse takeover." Conservative HQ replies with equal firmness, under Kemi Badenoch there will be no deals or pacts, although she talks quite openly of a pact in Wales, and she attacks Reform for wanting higher welfare spending and being too soft on Putin. But if you look just half a step behind the front stage rhetoric, you can see the hedging. Badenoch's line is no pacts at Westminster, but she refused to rule out power sharing in Wales at a devolved level, and there is talk of a group party over Christmas between the Conservatives and Reform. Robert Jenrick has been recorded talking about the need to bring this coalition together so that Reform and the Conservatives are not simply costing each other seats. A YouGov survey of Conservative members in October found that around 64% of the grassroots would welcome an electoral pact with Reform, and nearly half would support a full merger. If that happens, I think the final rump of the blue rinse middle ground Conservatives, the One Nation Conservatives, will completely defect to what? Lib Dems is the only alternative. Or sitting at home and not voting. So Farage and Badenoch are both doing a similar dance. Absolutely not until I decide it's in my interests. The real emotional barrier is 2019, of course. Farage has not forgotten, he's certainly not forgiven Boris. In that election, his Brexit party stood down candidates in hundreds of Conservative-held seats, essentially gifting Boris Johnson a clear run at Labour. In return, he expected a hard stop to EU alignment and a decisive cut in migration. Johnson got the majority, Farage got neither the personal influence nor the migration outcome he wanted. Since then, he has framed the story as one of betrayal. He delivered Johnson's landslide, and the Conservatives repaid him with what he regards as record migration and broken promises. That grievance now underpins his language. After 14 years of dishonesty and lies, they should never be forgiven. They betrayed my trust in 2019. Psychologically, that matters. Farage is no longer talking about alliance. He's talking about conquest. His preferred model is not the 2019 Brexit Party Tory truce, but something closer to the Canadian right in the early 2000s, where the old progressive Conservatives were eventually swallowed by the Reform Canadian Alliance movement. Hence, no deals, just a reverse takeover. He wants the Tories to come to him as suppliants, not partners. And that fury sharply reduces the probability of a tidy pre-announced national pact. He doesn't trust them not to repeat the 2019 in reverse, take the votes, then sideline him in office. Now, how do the internal dynamics of each party pull in opposite directions? Inside Reform, strategically, a pact could lock in seats and reassure nervous voters who fear wasting their vote. But brand-wise, Reform has grown by presenting itself as the party that refused to be house-trained by the Tory establishment. A national deal with the party that betrayed Brexit could look like a sellout to precisely the angry voters who fuel its surge. Farage also has a personal interest. His authority rests on the idea that he is the man who broke the old system. Signing a pact too early risks looking like capitulation at the very moment he is ahead. So, for Reform, an early pact carries the danger of looking weak, just as they look strong. Grassroots and many MPs are visibly tempted by the Reform deal. The Conservatives are tempted by the Reform deal. Around 2/3 of members favour some sort of pact, and nearly half would back a merger. Numerous ex-Tory MPs have already crossed the floor to Reform, including figures like Jonathan Gullis and Nadine Dorries. Yet donors still give far more to the Conservatives than to Reform, roughly triple the sums in the first half of this year. Those donors tend to like order, not surrender. Badenoch sees herself as custodian of a 200-year-old institution, not midwife to its dissolution. She has explicitly said she cannot treat the party like a toy and start playing with mergers. So the Tory party is split three ways: an institutional leadership that still dreams of recovery on its own terms, a grassroots base that is open to a deal, and a group of ambitious individuals who may decide their future lies on the Reform side of the bridge. That makes a neat pre-election pact hard to execute. Any leader who signs away dozens of safe seats to Farage would face furious resistance from colleagues whose careers are suddenly extinguished. So, what is the probability, really, of a pact? I think there are three separate scenarios. The first is a formal national pre-election pact announced before polling day. This would be the 2019 model on steroids. One party stands down in X seat and the other in Y, with joint press conferences and perhaps a shared programme on migration, tax and crime. Barriers to this? Well, Farage's 2019 trauma and insistence on a reverse takeover, Tory leadership pride and institutional self-preservation, and the risk to Reform's outsider brand. The push factors, MRP models suggest Reform might fall just short of a majority on current trends. Grassroots Tory pressure and sheer fear of extinction would play a role in this conversation. On net, my judgment would be that the probability of this neat pre-announced Westminster Pact remains low. Not impossible, but clearly under 1 in 3. It's the outcome most journalists like to talk about, but the one both party leaders are currently incentivized to deny. So, the more subtle story is the informal and localized cooperation before the election, which would require, it wouldn't require a national press conference, but it would require a lot of quiet choreography, like local non-aggressive pacts in a handful of marginal seats, especially in Wales and parts of England where Badenoch has already hinted at power-sharing flexibility, targeted candidate selections, the Conservatives choosing weak or token candidates, paper candidates, in seats where Reform is the natural challenger, and vice versa, encourage tactical messaging, with senior Conservatives hinting that good Conservatives can vote Reform here, to keep Labour out, even if no official pact exists. And this kind of shadow cooperation doesn't require Farage to forgive 2019, but it allows Badenoch to keep saying no pacts while activists on the ground say act otherwise. I would rate the probability of some informal coordination of this sort as quite high, well over 50-50, simply because rational actors under first past the post rarely keep driving full speed into each other forever. Finally, the most likely site of any real bargain may be after the votes are counted, a post-election governing deal if reform falls short. This is basically the Lib Dem, the Conservative Lib Dem coalition rethought. If an election on current numbers produces Reform as the largest party but short of a majority and Conservatives reduced to 40 to 70 seats, with Labour and the Lib Dems blocked from forming a stable alternative, then a confidence and supply arrangement or even a partial merger becomes much more tempting. Farage can then present it as not as doing a deal with a party that betrayed me, but as accepting the surrender of a defeated establishment in order to deliver the will of the people. Badenoch or any successor, I say that with only, of course, Badenoch or any successor can present it as saving some Conservative influence rather than watching Reform rule alone. And in that hung Parliament scenario, I would say the probability of some Reform Tory governing arrangement, confidence and supply, a partial coalition or an accelerated influx of Tory MPs into Reform is better than even. It might not be called a pact, but functionally it would be exactly that. So, to answer this clearly, a clear formal Reform Tory pact announced before the next election is a low probability, constrained by Farage's 2019 grievance and Tory institutional pride. The messier local under-the-radar coordination before polling day is much more likely, especially in Wales and selected English marginals. A post-election deal, if Reform is the largest party but still falls short of majority, plausibly the single most likely outright if the polling shape persists. Farage's talk of betrayal in 2019 makes a repeat of the subordinate role vanishingly unlikely, but if the Conservatives are reduced to a regional relic and Reform emerges as the main vehicle of the British right, the logic of power still points towards eventual convergence, not as a gentleman's pact among equals, but as the slow grudging absorption of one bruised tribe by another.